All right, so welcome to the final week of the semester. It's kind of hard to believe, although I guess when you consider that it's only 4 weeks long, makes it easier to believe, but I digress. What I wanted to do was get us through the last little bit of dynamic aggregate supply, aggregate demand. In particular, I want to sort of tell a couple of stories with it, and then also say a little bit about kind of the sort of final word on these short to medium run sort of fluctuation models, if you will, because we're going to be turning our attention to a model and a set of models that instead consider the economy over a very long run. And we'll talk a little bit about why those models exist, because I think one of the frustrations that students often have with the dynamic model in particular sort of belies one of the reason why there was also this development of growth models in conjunction with the dynamic model. So I wanted to kind of just again sort of say a little bit about what is typically kind of the most complicated part of the dynamic world, and that ends up being sort of this conversation about where do these sort of processes begin and end, especially in a world where we're discussing something like a shock. So in the video on Friday, the last video on Friday, I take you through sort of this demand shock. Let's just again quickly work through sort of the idea here, and then kind of say a little bit about what might be a bit still ambiguous. And then what we'll do is we'll frame this a little bit in the historical context, talk a little bit about the U.S. economy in the 60s and into the 1970s. And then ultimately, again, frame this in the context of the limitations, what we can and cannot say ultimately, or perhaps maybe what we can and cannot say using these particular sets of tools. Okay, so the idea here was that we had a 4-period demand shock, a demand shock that occurred in time period T, and then continued through until it went away in time period T plus 5. One of the sort of relative uh, sort of curious things about the dynamic world is that it's a world that's very much sort of focused on really these ideas of sort of one-off or short-run sorts of fluctuations. The idea of there sort of being permanent shocks, especially sort of permanent shocks to aggregate demand, as we'll discuss here in a moment, actually kind of becomes a difficult part of the analysis. The idea that there could be sort of persistent shocks to, say, full employment or full output, and therefore we can sort of think about sort of aggregate supply and aggregate demand shifting out together over time, as we expect under the context of economic growth. That becomes a little bit sort of easier to think in terms of a shock. But very often, if we're talking about maybe tax policy or government spending policy, for example, the fiscal stimulus that was implemented shortly after the COVID pandemic began, and then continued on into the preceding year, that was a temporary shock, technically. Now, what complicates sort of our ability to kind of tease out what the effect is of the temporary fiscal shock caused by, let's just say, the stimulus checks that were sent out to American citizens, is that in coinciding with that, there was other, in a sense, deficit spending coming from the federal government. And so, we can think about deficit spending as almost everywhere and always being, in some sense, stimulating, except for a fact if that deficit spending is coming during recessions, obviously. But if we're in deficit, the economy is not in recession, and we certainly weren't in recession at that time period, then we can think basically at any sort of deficit spending, G greater than T is going to be putting upward pressure on aggregate demand. And the only way that you alleviate that sort of pressure is if you attempt to balance the budget and bring G in line with T. There's sort of some economic reasons why we wouldn't do that for the most part, and certainly since the Great Recession, and again, kind of treating COVID as this very sort of one-off kind of economic shock. It's been mostly sort of a political reason why it's just kind of aggregate demand just keeps getting shoved out by fiscal policy, and so it's hard for us to kind of isolate something like the COVID stimulus because it's going on at the same time. There's all sorts of other essentially fiscal stimulus. It's just coming in the form of military spending, or it's coming in the form of infrastructure spending, or all the different ways in which the federal government spends money. So when we say in the dynamic world that something lasts for a particular amount of time, that of course is certainly a simplification of what actually happens in the economy. So the idea here is we move immediately from the aggregate demand and curve in time period T minus one, and then to time period T. You'll notice that when I describe dynamic models, I just like to kind of jump right into using 1, 2, 3, or 4 as opposed to T minus 1, T plus 1. It just seems way too confusing. It obviously makes it less generalized to some sort of mathematical idea, but I'm not too worried about that. But in the context of how it's typically written, so we move to a much higher level of aggregate demand in time period T. In this particular scenario, this is sort of an exogenous shock to aggregate demand. There's a lot of reasons why we might see an exogenous shock to aggregate demand that we think will eventually dissipate. One could be like a speculative bubble, right? So the sort of preceding consequence of the Great Depression was this sort of speculative bubble that was seemingly and certainly theoretically pushing aggregate demand beyond sort of potential output, right? So that's the tricky thing here, because that ends up being ultimately the costly part of this whole process when aggregate demand eventually shifts back, when that demand shock potentially dissipates. Because if the demand shock takes you above potential output, such that you now have a positive output cap, right? Because think about it. Not only are you going to have inflationary pressure due to any particular positive shift of aggregate demand, right? So all else equal, we know that a positive shift of aggregate demand is going to put upward pressure on inflation because it's going to create literal inflation. Then, of course, if there's persistence to inflation, meaning that we think about inflation next period as being partly expected of inflation this period, then you have now created inflation expectations just in the context of the movement of aggregate demand, right? So the fact that the economy has grown, in this case, out to YT, means that now there is upward pressure on inflation, right? And in a sense, that part's kind of not the worrisome part. The worrisome part is that in addition to just putting general inflationary pressure, you'll notice that at YT, we're far beyond potential output, right? YT minus 1, which establishes Y bar. So that means that not only are we going to have inflationary pressure coming from increased expected inflation, but we're also going to have higher inflationary pressure as induced now by the positive output gap. And so that's the reason why when we get to time period T plus 1 and then T plus 2, there is this cascading effect of ultimately inflation, because you are going to continually have a positive output gap. So basically, if you look at this process, starting with point B, so point B is the immediate effect of the demand shock. We then go back to point C, and the first, in a sense, kind of inflationary eat up of economic growth. So we shift back a little bit, then to D, then to E, then to F, right? So at any one of those stages, you're seeing that inflation's eating up some of the economic benefit of the aggregate demand shock. And in a sense, the extent to which inflation is eating up is going to be a function of how much inflation that we're actually experiencing. And if not only are we experiencing increased inflation expectations, but we also continue to have a persistent output gap, that's going to continue to put persistent upward pressure on inflation. That's why we get these shifts back of aggregate supply, because the inflation expectations coupled with the positive output cap are putting upward pressure ultimately on inflation, and therefore the aggregate supply curve is going to shift back. Now, the idea here is that the shock here dissipates in time period t plus 5. We get the aggregate demand curve shifts back, and that takes us to G. But before we get there, I want to sort of draw your attention to something, which is that if we had not, if the aggregate demand shock had not dissipated, in other words, it had stayed on, it was a permanent shock perhaps, then we would have continued to see in this dynamic sense, of course, that aggregate supply shift back until we have closed the output gap, right? That's the idea, because the higher expected inflation is going to continue pushing up inflation. And then, of course, the positive output gap is going to continue pushing it up. Now, you'll notice that the prediction here is going to be that the overall rate of growth in inflation is going to be declining. So that means that if we take this idea out into the real world, if we're in a situation in which we suspect that we have pushed aggregate demand out to the extent that we are now beyond full employment, and therefore that we are experiencing inflationary pressure, and then that inflationary pressure is also coinciding with in some sense, a slowdown of the economic system. Again, absent any sort of policy beyond the Taylor rule that's embedded here in the dynamic model, then we're just going to continue shifting back until we've completely closed that output gap. So you see here that classical argument that, in a sense, the economy is going to equilibrate back to full employment. The way that it gets there is that we have this increasing rate of inflation, albeit the sort of rate of inflation is slowing down, and then we're kind of landing in a sense back at that potential level of output. Now, in the particular example we see here in front of us, the demand shock goes away, and that's obviously very problematic, because when the demand shock goes away, now we find ourselves at a much lower level of output than potential, because those coinciding aggregate supply shifts have put us in a much more high inflationary world at a lower level of output. And now if we got to G and we just allowed things to go on without policy or whatever, we would expect, of course, those aggregate supply shocks to start to stop, because eventually, right, what's going to happen is that the expected inflation is going to stop, because we no longer have demand putting upward pressure on inflation. And so then what's going to happen is that once we get to, say, time period t plus 6, you're no longer getting increased inflation from expected inflation. And in addition to that, you now have a negative output gap. So the negative output gap is going to put downward pressure then, therefore, on inflation. So again, you get that kind of classical story. The economy is going to start to sort of, at least there's going to be a pressure for the economy to kind of equilibrate back towards full employment. So you can think, in a sense, that full employment kind of represents this sort of gravitational pull, no matter where the economy is in terms of like its short run equilibrium. And what policymakers really have to be aware of, if we buy the dynamic story, is not so much the behavior of inflation and or the behavior of output, but rather the gaps. The sort of inflation gap, that is where we want inflation to be relative to where it is, and then where output is relative to where we want it to be. And when you think about that in the context of modern, in particular, monetary policy, because fiscal policy has largely just gone insane, this is exactly what the Fed has been doing very successfully now for a couple of decades, which is that they are paying attention to inflation in the extent that they're not completely afraid of it. They're willing to endure inflation as long as the inflation is being caused by a positive output gap, right? That's the big thing, because the moment you're now only getting inflation due to the fact that you've had recent high inflation, you're not getting inflation caused by the output gap. Sure, the economy is supposed to deflate back, but you are also at this point having a lot of cyclical unemployment, because output is now below potential output. And so then this is where you start to get into the more Keynesian arguments, and you start to get concerned that at the very least, if your economy slips below potential output, you're kind of over the long run just going to get less economic growth as a result. So just in terms of the math, if we think about like over the next 10 years, how much economic growth are we going to get? Then closing the output gap is certainly a way to kind of ensure that we get more economic growth than we otherwise would get. However, we have to think very much in terms of the potential for any kind of persistent aggregate demand policy, whether it's something like, pro-cyclical fiscal policy or pro-cyclical monetary policy, where instead of being worried about inflation, we're just trying to kind of juice the economy and get it kind of working as fast as possible. The reason why this ultimately most likely causes runaway inflation is because you then have inflation arising from multiple reasons, as opposed to say just one reason, the output gap, or just one reason, inflation expectations. And so, in a sense, the sort of rapid economic growth is very tricky in an inflationary world. So, in a world where money matters, in a world where purchasing power matters, and then in a particular in a world where those things then filter themselves back into kind of, again, that kind of political business cycle that we've been talking about, then you get this really interesting interplay between expectations about the economy and then ultimately how the economy plays out. I put a question on the quiz this week that basically sort of posits this idea that if you buy the idea of adaptive expectations in terms of inflation, and I think most economists do, then a world in which people are constantly talking about costs, people are constantly talking about egg prices or gas prices, and just even if it's just general, kitchen table conversations, if enough people are having those conversations, you absolutely can start thinking about inflation expectations as also incorporating that component. So it isn't just inflation that we had last period, but it's also the inflation that I think is going on right now, which is almost a completely different idea than expected inflation, right? There's expected inflation, which is that this is the inflation I think I'm going to experience. And we certainly can imagine or even expect that to alter, behavior. But then there's the inflation that I think I'm experiencing now, that I think I'm going through right now. And what's interesting about this is that it might be such that due to just the nature of the virality, if you will, maybe of social media, and if we buy the idea that maybe that heightens our sort of perspectives and emotions in other ways, like in relationships, it might could do that also with economic news. And so I wonder now if we have to start thinking about social media as also being this potential inflationary component to the economy. I don't know. That sort of remains to be seen. If there wasn't enough reason for us to be, concerned about social media. So the other thing I wanted to do real quick is I wanted to move over here to the whiteboard, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, sort of the limitations of this model, and then also talk about and sort of motivate our movement into the growth section of the economy. So let's just take a second here and kind of calibrate our brains to what we're looking at here. So I have here permanent aggregate demand increase, and then I'm putting here via tax reform. I put tax reform here because there have been multiple examples of stated, permanent tax cuts. We call them tax reforms, but they're almost always tax cuts. So Kennedy had permanent tax cuts. Reagan had permanent tax cuts. So those were at least two examples of tax cuts that were in no way meant to be temporary. And what's interesting in particular about the Kennedy tax cut is that this was really the first time we had ever cut taxes without specifically making up for it in terms of spending cuts. So basically, this was an attempt to grow the economy via deficit spending induced by tax cuts. So it's it's just funny because it's a very Keynesian thing to do if at the time the economy was below potential output. Now, to some extent, one of the things that we have to grapple with in economics is that we don't necessarily know where we are economically until years later. Now, looking back on the late 1960s, I'm sorry, the late 1950s and early 1960s, it's clear to us that the economy is below potential output. There had been multiple recessions at the tail end of the 1950s. A lot of this had to do with the sort of reorganization of the economy post wars, and just the kind of the sort of drastic reduction in military spending sort of induced this aggregate demand shock. It just took a while for the economy to sort of work that out. So the economy was quite weak in the early 1960s, and so this was really like a let's boost the economy via tax cuts. It was a sort of very Keynesian idea. Kennedy was very heavily influenced by Keynes, apparently, and really more so than that, the people that Kennedy surrounded himself with for his economic advisors, they were very heavily influenced by Keynesian ideas. So if we just look at this graph here real quick, we can think about that permanent aggregate demand increase right here from AD 1 to AD 2. I think it's the post-tax reform as being sort of point B. So post-tax reform, kind of immediate effect of tax reform is we have pushed the economy from where we were below potential output, and then now we are above potential output. So if we look back at the late 1950s, early 1960s, is it also the case that we have very low inflation? Absolutely. So that all works nicely in this particular model. So sort of in a sense, so far so good. Okay. Then, as we would expect to happen, we expect there to be inflationary pressure in the economy, and to the extent where potentially there is some crowding out, some eating up of the output growth due to this particular inflationary idea. So again, we go back, we look at the 1960s. Do we see inflation pick up shortly after the tax reform? Absolutely. And so you see inflation starting to pick up speed in the 1960s. And then the story of the 1960s is really that we just keep pushing aggregate demand out. First, we just do this with continued fiscal policy. So the Lyndon Johnson administration, of course, has the war on poverty. That's a dramatic increase in domestic spending. We ramped up the war in Vietnam. That's a dramatic increase in government spending and boost aggregate demand. So you just have aggregate demand just continuing to being shifted out. And in a sense, that is avoiding the potential pitfall of inflationary pressure, right? Because you're pushing aggregate demand out, and then by continually pushing it out, you're not allowing the economy to sort of move back at any point, right? So, typically, if we think about this, we go from Y1 to Y2, and then we're going to kind of shift back to Y3, right? Well, the idea here is that once we got to Y2, there was going to be even more, fiscal stimulus, and so aggregate demand just keeps getting shifted out. And so again, okay, so now do we look at the 60s? Do we see significant economic growth? Absolutely. Very, very rapid economic growth in the 1960s, especially in the sort of Johnson into Nixon administrations. The economy was really kind of cooking, and looking back on it now, sort of overcooking, because what also happens during this time period, curiously, is that the Fed basically just stops fighting inflation. Or, you have to also understand is that up to this point, the U.S. economy hadn't really had this debate very much about fighting inflation or whatever. And so the Fed was sort of still figuring out exactly what it was going to do. And in the 60s, the Fed really took on a pro-growth perspective. And so they're not fighting or really trying to fight this boost in aggregate demand. And in fact, around 1967 into 1968, they kind of drop all pretense of that and start running expansionary monetary policy. So aggregate demand keeps getting sort of pushed out. And then what ends up happening is that we go into the early 1970s. Nixon keeps doing all of this. I've mentioned before on multiple occasions, Nixon pressures Arthur Burns to continue running expansionary monetary policy. And then there is this really quick and rapid shift of essentially potential output in the economic system, to the extent that the output gap becomes so large in the economy that the inflationary pressure kind of pops, if you want to think about it that way. So when we get to like 74, 75, there's so much inflation now, and the supply shock is so big in the context of, it's an oil price shock, so it shows up in every sort of part of the economic system. And so that initial kind of 74, 75 recession ends up being a fairly big recession because we're kind of coming back. Incomes fall, and they fell from this big plateau because they had been propped up with years and years and years of fiscal stimulus, years and years and years of monetary stimulus. And then when the supply shocks hit, the economy immediately went into recession, incomes fell precipitously. And so it's very similar to what you see here in this graph. Aggregate demand to the left here, aggregate demand shifts back all the way, and then the economy is left with low output and high inflation, right? High inflation and high unemployment. That's stagflation, right? That's the stagflation idea. So the story then, kind of as we move into the mid 70s and the late 80s, is that we really have this inflationary story that really starts to feel runaway, because every attempt to just continue boosting aggregate demand, because by the way, we continue to do that through the Nixon into the Ford administrations. We continue to have expansionary monetary policy. We continue to have, in a sense, expansionary fiscal policy. Aggregate demand just keeps getting pushed out. And so when there wasn't a supply shock, output was pretty good, right? You go back to 76, 77, 78, economy grows pretty rapidly. I think in 78, 70, around 78, we're getting like 5% economic growth. That's really good, probably too good relative to what's about to happen. And then it's again, we hit another supply shock at the tail end of the 1970s, and it's a slap back in the face. It's like, in a sense, we were sort of delusional. Somebody threw a bucket of cold water, it woke us back up. And the problem is that when it woke us back up, of course, we found ourselves in recession and still with persistently high unemployment and persistently high inflation. Now, the sort of like, how did we get out of this, right? Because the interesting thing is that we have this sort of reset in the 80s with the Volcker recession, the 80-81 recession that was induced by Volcker really deciding, I'm going to fight inflation. And so then the idea is like, well, how do we come out of this? What's the process by which we come out of this? And the idea is that we have the Volcker recession in 81, but then, we have the tax reforms under the Reagan administration, which they had been signaling for a rather long time prior to the actual reforms. Another thing that happened with Kennedy signaled tax cuts, and then they didn't pass until he was actually after he was assassinated. But in a sense, we look back and we think that the announcement of the tax cuts probably boosted the economy in and of themselves, due to the rational expectations. And so when we look at the sort of Reagan tax cuts, you get a very similar situation. You get a tax cut, which then coincides with a very extended time period of low inflation. You would not typically think that you would get a tax cut with low inflation unless there was also a significant period of positive potential output growth. So what we also have happened in the early 80s is that basically once the economy starts to recover from the stagflation era, and once inflation expectations get pulled back into line, we actually get a pretty significant productivity shock in the 80s. If you look at the U.S. economy in terms of productivity measures in the 1980s, productivity really starts to take off. And so, again, in many ways, I think whether or not you sort of like the approach of the Reagan tax cuts or the Kennedy tax cuts, they came at a time period when the economy was not doing well, and they both were meant to sort of boost the overall long run growth prospects of the economy, in a sense, by just waking it up. And I think if you look at the data, a lot of success there. The difference is that after the 80s, we sort of learned the lesson of the sort of dynamics of these things. And so monetary policy became much better after the 1970s. And so we didn't have that same sort of problem in the 1960s. And I would also, basically put a lot of this at Nixon's feet as well. I think Nixon was an especially problematic president during this time period is sort of almost uniquely opportunistic, and his policy, preferences were in pursuit of his own success, not really at any point actually at the success, long run success of the U.S. economy. So anyway, I thought that would be a nice little sort of tag on dynamic ASAD, and sort of put a button onto that, and then move us into the solo growth conversation that we're going to have for the rest of this week.